My name is Charlie Fuquay. I'm 74 years old at the time I'm making this video. My plan is to put it on Rumble. I'm a retired attorney. I've been an Arkansas state representative, and actually, it's been 44 years ago that I discovered what I'm going to share with you today. And I believe that what I'm sharing today is the most important topic in politics today. By the way, I've been a county chairman of a Republican Party in Arkansas, and I am currently the vice chairman of the 1st Congressional District Republican Committee in Arkansas. And I have found through the years that most people do not believe what I am about to share. But after 44 years of it being, how can I put this, the central focus of my life, I have come to believe that what I am going to share with you is absolutely true. And it is the most earth shaking, mind changing thing that I can tell, that anybody can tell you. And what it involves is how money is created by banks. And I'll go into that in more detail, but what this video is, it's basically a trip through my life as to how I believe God put me in situations and in contact with people that exposed me to these truths that most people just don't know today. And frankly, due to cognitive dissonance, that is the fact that most people reject what they don't already believe, due to cognitive dissonance, most people reject what I'm going to share today. And also due to the fact that our news media is not honest and truthful. And many people believe they tell us lies, but the most important thing they do to leave us in the dark is they simply don't tell the truth. And I'm going to share that important truth with you today as to how money is created. But I'm going to start out by taking you on a trip through my life. Okay, first of all, I was born in St. Louis and I had wonderful parents, working class family in St. Louis. And like I said, I believe God put me on earth to tell people how banks create money as debt. Um, I was not born rich. I can remember when I was a kid, for supper, eating the last of the oatmeal we had in the house. We didn't have sugar or milk to put on it, so I ate it without that. And in the morning, I went to school without breakfast because there was nothing left in the house to eat. Now, by noon of that day, my grandfather showed up and brought us groceries. And I didn't go hungry many times in my childhood, but that's a time I remember. So we were a family that scraped by. Okay? Now, my grandfather was a Southern Baptist minister. And after he retired from being a minister and he went to Louisville Theological Seminary, but after he retired from being a regular minister, for over 20 years, every week, he would preach in a different Black Baptist church in the St. Louis area. And an event that occurred with him is what was my first awakening as to what our world was like. I used to stay with him in the summers, and I was spending a few weeks with him. And he had a telephone on a little desk, and he was sitting at his desk, and the phone would ring, and it would be an angry black minister. Now, these black ministers were his best friends. He loved these people, and they loved him. But these black ministers were angry. Now, I was about 11 years old at the time, and he'd hang up the phone and it'd ring again with another angry black minister. And I can't tell you how many times that happened, but it was over and over again. And then I remember the only time I ever heard my grandfather curse. He called the newspaper because the newspaper in St. Louis had published an article of how much he wanted Martin Luther King to come to St. Louis. And when he spoke to that newspaper, he said that what they printed was a damned lie. And like I say, that's the only time I ever heard him cuss. And when he spoke to these black ministers, he told them that not only had the newspaper not interviewed him about this subject or any other subject, but he had never addressed the subject of Martin Luther King to any person ever in his life. I don't even know what his position was on Martin Luther King. But the black ministers of St. Louis had gotten together and had a meeting, and they had voted that they were not going to support Martin Luther King coming to St. Louis, because they said in St. Louis, the black and the white community get along pretty good together. We don't have a lot of trouble. And if he comes, there may be problems, and we don't want those problems. So that was my first wake up as to how honest the news media was. They just made up the story completely out of nothing because they wanted Martin Luther King to come to St. Louis because it would make news and sell newspapers. And that's what the media is all about, lying for profit. Now, I can remember another significant event in my childhood growing up in St. Louis. When I was in grade school, we took a trip to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And I can remember seeing pallets of money and having it explained to me that that was money that was old money and it was bound up to be destroyed. And I thought, how do you destroy money? It's worth a lot. Why would you do that? And as a child, that's the one thing I really remember about that trip. But anyway, that was another event that got me interested in banking and what goes on with banks. Okay, I want to tell you this. In school, because I'm dyslexic, I did not make good grades. I'm left-handed. I don't know if that has anything to do with dyslexia, but I had very poor grades in school. As a kid growing up, my main interest was bicycle racing. In St. Louis, they had a velodrome, a track, and that was my life, was bicycle racing. Well, I was the Missouri Junior State Champion when I was 17, still in high school. And I developed a friendship with a man by the name of Joe Becker. Now, when I won the Junior State Championship, in that year, he won the Senior State Championship for the seventh time. He was 20 years my senior. But Joe and I developed a friendship, even though we were in competing cycling clubs that actually hated each other. But he just somehow liked me, and we developed a friendship. And he would sell bikes out of his basement and sell bicycle parts. And he was a devout Catholic. I was Southern Baptist. And his father ran a Catholic supply store. They sold rosaries and all kinds of things that Catholics buy. And he lived upstairs from that store. And in the basement of that store was this bike shop he had. Now, at times he'd have me build wheels for him. And he'd sell these wheels to people. And anyway, we developed this friendship. And I'm going to put that aside because I'm going to come back to Joe Becker. He's a very significant figure in my life. Anyway, um, the Vietnam War came along. I graduated from high school with very poor grades. I had an uncle that had been in the Coast Guard, and he said, "Hey, the Coast Guard's the best branch of the service. You ought to join the Coast Guard." Well, it was either get drafted or join. So I joined the Coast Guard, based on my uncle's advice. Well, the years came and went, and I was discharged from the Coast Guard. And I didn't go to Vietnam. I was a boiler tender on a ship. I served in the North Atlantic. Anyway, when I got out of the Coast Guard, my friend Joe Becker and I got back together. And at that point, he owned two bicycle shops. And he asked me if I would manage one of them for him. And, it was kind of a childhood dream of mine to have a bicycle shop. So I really had to think hard on it. But I had decided somehow in the Coast Guard, I turned into a good student. At Boiler Tender School, I got really good grades, graduated close to the top of my class, and I advanced through the ranks very rapidly by taking correspondence courses and end of course exams. And somehow, I guess, maturity finally reached me, and I became a very good student in the Coast Guard. And so when I got out, I thought, I think I want to go to college. So I turned Joe Becker down and went to college. Anyway, graduated from college and bought a home in South St. Louis. It was an old home and it was in bad shape. And I completely replumbed the plumbing because it had to be done. Anyway, my friend Joe Becker knew that I had done that. And one time he was having to replace a hot water heater in his house. So he called me up and says, "Hey, can you come over and explain to me how to do this and what to do?" So I did. And when I went over there that night, I would say was the most significant night in my lifetime. Because while I was there, Joe Becker told me some really crazy things. Now, Joe Becker, I believe, had a master's degree. I know he graduated from St. Louis University in business administration. Anyway, he told me that the Federal Reserve was privately owned and that all money was created as debt by banks. And I loved Joe Becker. We were good friends, but I politely told him that he was nuts, that was not true, that the government created our money. Well, anyway, it just so happened at that time that I was working at Monsanto Chemical Company, and I had been a lab technician, but I was only hired on as a temporary lab technician because they couldn't hire me on it was through a temporary organization. They couldn't hire me directly because they had too many white men. And at that time, it was the law that they had to have certain ratios of white men and women and black people. It was federal law. So I couldn't be hired on at Monsanto directly. So I served through this temporary organization. But as I did that, there were 7 operating companies with Monsanto. And one of the newer companies, the Ag Products Company, still had room for white males. So I got a job there working as a research biologist. Now, my degree was in biology. I had a minor in chemistry, and for a year or two, I was a chemistry and biology teacher in high school. But anyway, I left that to move on, looking for higher pay and more opportunities. So anyway, I was hired on in the Monsanto Ag Products Company. But I had a desire to work in chemical sales, and I'd always wanted to move to a rural area. I didn't want to live in the city. And so my desire was to work as a agricultural chemical salesman for Monsanto Chemical Company. But I was told that to do that, I needed a master's degree in business. So I went back to the University of Missouri at St. Louis, where I'd gotten my undergraduate degree, and I started working on an MBA. And I was taking classes at night, working on this MBA while I was working as a research biologist at Monsanto. And that's when Joe Becker called me over to help with the hot water heater. So, anyway, he told me all those crazy things. And then he gave me a book by a man by the name of Merrill Jenkins. And Merrill Jenkins, he grew up as kind of a nerdy kid. He was a coin collector. But then he got a degree in mechanical engineering. And he went to work for a company in St. Louis, and I believe the name of the company was National Reject. And they made the coin changers in soda machines and candy machines and all that. I believe that the dollar changer was an invention of Merrill Jenkins. Well, anyway, he was working at this company, and the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis came to Merrill Jenkins and they said, "Hey, is there some way we could make coins out of something other than silver and they be accepted by your machines?" And he says, "Sure, you could make them out of copper and sandwich them between two layers of nickel." And so I said the Federal Reserve made them. Actually, it's the U.S. Mint that makes them, but it's the Federal Reserve that issues them. So anyway, you all know what happened from that. All of our coins since that time have been the sandwich coins. And anyway, then while they were putting these sandwich coins into circulation, the Federal Reserve Bank came back to Merrill Jenkins and they said, "Hey, could you build some machines that can separate the silver coins from the sandwich coins?" And so he designed and his company built those machines. And they pulled that silver out of circulation as fast as they could. But Merrill Jenkins saw this and he started thinking about this. And he thought, something's not right here. They're telling us that the sandwich coins and the silver coins have exactly the same value, but they're pulling that silver out of circulation as fast as they can. And so he started researching how money's created. And he wrote this book, Money, the Greatest Hoax on Earth. And that's the book that Joe Becker had and read and gave to me. And anyway, I took that book home, and that night I started reading it. And when I got into the book, now, it's not an easy read. It's very technical, very complex, very detailed. I couldn't put the book down. I read all night long. I didn't go to sleep at all. Finished the book before morning, and my life was changed. I thought, the world is not what I thought it was. And in that book, he explained how all money is created not by the federal government, but by privately owned banks, the Federal Reserve banking system, which each of the 12 Federal Reserve banks is owned by the member banks in its district. Well, anyway, as I said, I was working on an MBA at the time, and I was taking a course, and actually I had to write a term paper for that course, and I have the term paper right here, and I've kept it. And the name of the term paper is, oh, by the way, the course was in government regulation of some aspect of private industry. Well, I had learned that the banking industry was a private industry and that there was government regulation of it through the Federal Reserve System. And so that's what I wrote my term paper on. And the name of the term paper that I wrote was The Ultimate Monopoly, Economic Enslavement. And it was impartial fulfillment of the requirements for public policies toward business. And it was written in April of 1980. And in that paper, I explained the things that Merrill Jenkins taught me. But actually, by the way, I said I was working as a research biologist at Monsanto Chemical Company at the world headquarters in St. Louis when I wrote this paper. Now, Monsanto had a wonderful corporate library. Now, this is before the days of the internet. So I did my research by going to the corporate library. Now, where did I start my research? Well, the first place I went was Encyclopedia Britannica. And I want to read you a quote from Encyclopedia Britannica. A Federal Reserve Bank is owned by the member commercial banks in its district. And I learned a lot of other things from Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, I have learned since then, most of us do our research on the internet, but the internet is scrubbed of truthful information about banking. Now, why is that? Because if you can create money out of nothing, you can control everything. You can control the news media, you can control the educational system, Hollywood. You can buy the best politicians money can buy. So they control everything. And that's what I came to realize. But anyway, I wrote that paper, and it became the central focus of my life for the next 44 years that I've constantly researched this subject and done presentations on it in various places. Anyway, by the way, when I was in college, I got good grades as opposed to when I was in high school where I got poor grades. And I think that was just maturing and learning how to overcome my dyslexia. I wanted to tell you another thing, and I skipped this and I need to go back to it. I told you that I was hired on at Monsanto, and I was hired on as a temporary because they couldn't hire white males because of federal law. Anyway, I taught at St. Louis Public Schools before that as a chemistry, physics, and biology teacher. And one time the principal called me into his office and he says, "Hey, I need to counsel with you on your career path." And my uncle had been the principal of the largest high school in the state of Missouri. And so I thought, well, my uncle could be a high school principal. Why can't I? And so I told him that I thought I'd like to move into administration. Now, he was a black man, my principal. Wonderful man. I liked him. He was a good principal. But he told me, well, it's not possible for a white male to move into administration in St. Louis Public Schools because we already have too many. So due to federal law, you cannot enter into administration. And that's really why I left the school system, because I could see that there was no advancement for me there. And so I was ambitious at that time. And so I wanted to do better than that. Anyway, I know I skipped that, but anyway, I was working towards an MBA in order to get this job as an agricultural chemical salesman. I got the job, and I moved to rural Illinois and became a sales representative for Monsanto. It was a good time in my life. I was married, had 2 children at the time, maybe one and one on the way. But anyway, moved to rural Illinois, and I put together a slide presentation on this subject and went around and gave that presentation to anybody who would listen to it. Actually, where I gave it the most was in Quaker churches. And I think the reason the Quakers were so interested in that is they are pacifist. And I made clear that banking is the cause of all wars. And it really is, because the bankers get rich on war. And so banking has been the cause of most human suffering in the world for at least the last 200 years, probably a lot longer than that. Okay, I'm looking through my notes here to see what I want to talk about next. Anyway, while I wrote this term paper and was doing this research in the library, the Monsanto Library in St. Louis, one of the significant books I came across that really gave me a lot of insight was a book written by a man by the name of Paul S. Nadler. He was the advisor to the American Banking Association, and he was a economics professor at New York University. And the name of the book is Commercial Banking in the Economy. It's by Random House. And it was a book to be a textbook for bankers, is what it was written for. And I found a lot of interesting things in that book. On page 14 of the book, it says, and I quote, commercial banks, on the other hand, and why the reason it's saying on the other hand, it was talking about financial intermediaries such as savings and loans and insurance companies. But he says, commercial banks, on the other hand, can create money, as will be shown when a commercial bank makes a loan. It actually creates new checking account deposit money that did not exist before. Then it goes on to say, the ability of the bank to create money is the basic difference between a bank and a financial intermediary. I want to read another quote from that book. Well, actually, I'm going to tell you a story, okay? And this example was given in this book. And it's given as the beginning of banking. And it describes the goldsmiths of the Middle Ages. And I'm not going to read it, I'll just tell it in my own words because I think I can give you a brief understanding of this. The book describes how the goldsmiths of the Middle Ages were not only artisans in gold, but since gold was valuable, they had to have a safe place to keep it, so they had a vault to store gold in. So people that had excess gold that they didn't need to spend or have made into jewelry or whatever at the time, they would deposit it for safekeeping with the goldsmith. The goldsmith would issue them a receipt for the gold. Now, when somebody wanted to buy something, they'd simply use gold and pay say a shoemaker with the appropriate amount of gold to pay for the shoes. Well, the goldsmith at times would lend out his own gold at interest, make a little revenue off of it. Over time, the tendency developed in the economy of the Middle Ages that when somebody wanted to spend their gold, rather than take the receipt back to the goldsmith, get the gold and spend the gold, they would simply spend the receipt. The receipts began to circulate in the economy as if they were the money or medium of exchange. They were not. The medium of exchange was gold, but the receipts circulated as if they were gold. Well, now, as I said, the goldsmith at times would lend out his own gold at interest. Well, one day, somebody came to the goldsmith to borrow gold. But when the goldsmith looked in his vault, all of his own gold was already loaned out at interest. But the person that wanted to borrow the gold said, I'd really rather just have one of your receipts. It's easier to carry. Rather than loaning me the gold directly, why don't you just issue one of your receipts? And the goldsmith thought, I have all this gold here that people have deposited for safekeeping. Most of it just sits there a good bit of the time. Who would know if I had more receipts outstanding for gold than I have gold? And so what he did, he sat down and wrote a second receipt for a unit of gold in his vault that already had a receipt issued against it. And he loaned that receipt into existence as the medium of exchange at interest. Now, over time, the goldsmith learned that he could write multiple receipts for every unit of gold that he had in his bank for safekeeping, loan it into existence, and earn interest on it. The goldsmith became very wealthy. As a matter of fact, he became the lender to the king. He was the most powerful and influential person in medieval society. Now, there could be a problem here. What if there was a whisper campaign and people went around and said, I don't think the goldsmith has enough gold in his vault to redeem all the receipts he issued. You know what we call that? We call that a run on the bank. And it could destroy the goldsmith, and the people would take him out and hang him. And that happened at times. But what also happened at times, the goldsmith got so powerful that he wasn't required to redeem his receipts because the king's military protected him because he loaned the king money as well. And so anyway, that is the origin of the banking system as described by P.S. Nadler in his book on money and banking. Now, it was several years later that I took my family on vacation to Chicago, lived in Illinois at the time. So we went on vacation to Chicago at that time. Chicago was a nice place to visit. That was a lot of years ago. We went to the Museum of Science and Industry. And in that Museum of Science and Industry, there was an exhibit down, I think, in the basement, somewhere low in the museum, where it was an exhibit on banking, and they had models of bank buildings through history. They had a model of the Federal Reserve Bank building and the First Bank of the United States and the Bank of England and other banks through history. And as you trace backwards through the exhibit, the first building was a Babylonian temple. And the exhibit explained how banking was actually created in ancient Babylon. And this is many years before the birth of Christ. And I studied this to a great extent and dug it out. And the system was exactly the same as the goldsmiths of the Middle Ages, except the money in Babylon was actually wheat. And there was a wheat bank or a grain bank. And the system was exactly the same. The grain banker loaned out multiple receipts for every unit of grain he had. So this is an ancient system. As a matter of fact, the Bible talks about Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of whores and abominations of the earth. And if you really study Babylon, for example, the Tower of Babel, it was designed as a mockery of God. And actually the goal was to build the tower high enough to put archers on the top of the tower to shoot arrows into heaven, kill God, and rip him out of heaven. Now I know that sounds like a stupid idea to us, but the book of Jasher, which is actually mentioned in the Bible, says that was the purpose of the Tower of Babel. And Babylon was all about exalting man above all else as the highest creature there could be. And it was the overthrow of God. That's what Mystery Babylon is. And it's interesting. I believe it was Lord Acton that said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And bankers have nearly absolute power. If you can create money out of nothing, it makes you so powerful. You have the power to convince people of things that aren't true at all. For example, you have the power to convince people that it's a good idea to cut off little girls' breasts and little boys' penis and testicles and pump them full of poison chemicals to change their gender. Now, you can't change somebody's gender. Remember, I was a biology major. Because gender is determined at the cellular level. If a person has two X chromosomes, that person's a female. If that person has an X and a Y chromosome, that person's a male. That can't be changed. It's decided at the moment of conception, because either a sperm that has an X or a Y chromosome from the father will fertilize an egg that only has X chromosomes from the mother. And how are we convinced of this stupidity? It's because the bankers have absolute power and they control all means of communication and dissemination of information. And the one thing they don't want the people to know is how money is created. Okay, let me see where I am in my notes here. Okay, anyway, life goes on. And I had a friend, actually was the minister of the church I went to, who was going to law school. And I was 40 years old at the time. And I mentioned to him, and he was at least 10 years younger than me, maybe more than that I had always dreamed of going to law school. And he said, well, quit dreaming and do it. And so I thought, I don't know. And he said, well, I tell you what, come to law school with me. And he was preaching in Terre Haute, Indiana, but he was going to law school in Columbia, Missouri, and drove back and forth to preach every Sunday. He said, well, come back with me and you can go to some of my classes, see what you think, and if you decide, go to law school. So I did. And I thought, this is fascinating. And so I decided to go to law school at 40. So I applied for several law schools, got accepted at some, rejected by many, and I was accepted by the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. So I went to law school at age 40 at the University of Arkansas. And I started in 1990, graduated in 1993. Now, I'm not sure if I was still in law school or just graduated. I think I had just graduated and I became a Gideon. Now, some of you may not know what a Gideon is. The Gideons are Christian business and professional men that distribute Bibles. We put them in hotels and motels, distribute them in schools and colleges. Just about any place we can distribute a copy of God's Word, we do, because we believe God's Word is important. So anyway, I became a Gideon. And one time we had a meeting, and it was at a place called the AQ Chicken House in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And we had a guest speaker at our meeting, and his name was Viktor Goncharenko. And he was the first Gideon in the Soviet Union. And like I say, this was, probably 1994 or so that this occurred. It may have been later than that, maybe 95 or so. But anyway, at dinner, he sat directly across the table from me. And through his son, Simon, who was going to school at John Brown University in the area, because he didn't speak English, but Simon did, he told me, he said, Charlie, the Gideons of Russia are praying that someday the Gideons of the United States will have the same freedom to distribute God's word in the United States that we now have in Russia. I thought, am I losing my mind? The evil Russian communist have more freedom or give more freedom to distribute God's word than we have in the United States? What I didn't know, and what many Americans still don't know today, and this is 2024 when I'm making this, what many Americans still don't know is Russia hasn't been a communist country since the time of Boris Yeltsin. I don't know how many years ago that is now, probably close to 40 at this point. But anyway, he told me that, and it just blew my mind. But that got me starting to study Russia and what's going on in Russia. But anyway, a little while after that, I ran for state representative in Arkansas, got elected to state representative, just served one term, then took a job with the Arkansas Office of Chief Counsel. And actually, that was my last employment as an attorney, and I worked there for, I think, 14 years. While I was working there, I authored or wrote a book titled God's Law, the Only Political Solution. And when I wrote that book, chapter 13 of the book was entitled God, a Better Than Fair Economist. And basically what the book argues is we're buried in unnecessary law. And as a lawyer, I knew that nobody can understand the law or know what it is. If you're going to practice law, you got to find some area of the law and practice there because you can't know all of it. But anyway, I thought we were buried in unnecessary law. And the point of the book is that if we would just follow the Big Ten, the Ten Commandments, we wouldn't need a lot of other law. A honest and righteous judge applying those 10 laws could come to a righteous judgment in every case. And so that's my point in the book. But anyway, chapter 13 is entitled God, a Better Than Fair Economist. And in that chapter of the book, by the way, the name of the book is God's Law, the Only Political Solution. And it is available on Amazon, or you can get it from me if you want to. And by the way, my email address is Charles R, as Roger, my middle name, and then my last name, Fuqua, Fuqua, @gmail.com. I sell the books for $15 over the internet, and that includes the postage to get it to you. Anyway, if you want a copy of that book, send me an email or send me a check, and I'll send you the book. Or, as I say, you can get the book. It's a Kindle book. So, anyway, I started telling you about Russia and how, as a Gideon, I found out that Russia had rejected communism. Now, most of us don't know that today. But I have been writing articles and sending them out to my email list to anybody that I can on the fact that both Republicans and Democrats, and I've been writing these articles probably for 8 years or so, have been having a drumbeat that the United States should go to war with Russia. Now, I think that's a really bad idea. I believe it could lead to nuclear war that causes death of all life on Earth. And I think that's a really bad idea. But with what's going on in Ukraine today, the United States has been pushing Russia toward that war. And I want to talk a little about that because I think that's so important today. And remember, banks create money out of nothing, loan it to people. Commercial banks loan it to individuals. All they have to do is write a check on themselves, give it to a borrower, and the new money's created and comes into existence. Or when the federal government deficit spends, it can print a bond and sell it. Or how most of it is handled is that the government borrows from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, remember, that's owned by the commercial banks in its district, creates the money out of nothing, loans it to the government, and then the people are taxed to pay back the privately owned Federal Reserve what they created out of nothing at no expense plus interest. Now, that is so profitable. And because it's so profitable, it gives those bankers, the people that control the national and really international banking systems, godlike power. And they believe they're God. They believe they can do anything and have been doing all kinds of horrible things. Anyway, when Gorbachev became the leader of Russia, he instituted glasnost and perestroika, which is restructuring and change. Anyway, it gave the Russian people freedom they had never experienced. And then communist hardliners took control of the army and they rolled tanks into Moscow to crush Gorbachev's government. But protesters that supported the end of communism stood in the streets in the face of those tanks. And one of those protesters that led that protest was Boris Yeltsin. The tanks did not crush the protesters. The Russian soldiers just wouldn't do it. And so communism ended in the Soviet Union. Constituent republics were set free, and people of faith in Russia, because you remember for 100 years, the communists killed or are sent to the gulags Christians in Russia. But people of faith believed, and I believe, that it was an act of God when communism fell in Russia. And today, the Russian people, of all people on planet Earth, despise communism more than anybody else, except maybe the Chinese, because they lived under it for 100 years and they knew how bad it was. But anyway, I need to go into the history of what's going on in Ukraine a little bit. I want to make this as short as I can. The first capital of Russia was Kiev, not Kyiv, Kiev. And Grand Prince Vladimir the Great, or Vladimir the First, was the ruler in Kiev and the ruler of all the Rus, and that's where we get the name Russians. And he became a Christian, and I won't go into that. It's an interesting story. And he required all of the Rus to be baptized and accept Christianity. A few years later, the Ottoman Turks drove the Rus out of Kiev, and the Ottoman Turks, Muslims, took control of that area, and the Rus, or Russians, moved their capital north to Moscow. Anyway, after that, the Golden Horde, the descendants of Genghis Khan, became Muslims. And for some 200 or more years, they dominated Russia, and Russia was held in subjection over them. But then at some point, Russia got powerful enough, and the Golden Horde had internal strife, and the Russians threw off the descendants of Genghis Khan and became a free nation. Anyway, over time, they reconquered that area where Kiev is, and that area was called the Ukraine, not Ukraine, the Ukraine, because it wasn't a country, it was a region within Russia. It was actually one of the Russian republics. And when the Soviet Union dissolved, it became its own separate nation at that point and became its own republic. Anyway, time comes and goes, and Russia is prospering. Boris Yeltsin gets sick, and his policies don't do what he intended them to do, and he becomes unpopular. But he selects the next leader of Russia, and he selects a young man by the name of Vladimir Putin. Now, under Vladimir Putin, Russia has done really well. Their economy has thrived. Putin has a degree from St. Petersburg University in free market economics. So, anyway, time comes and goes, and Ukraine, the nation of Ukraine, has to decide. Oh, I've skipped something. Putin comes to NATO, and he says, "Hey, why was NATO formed? It was formed to oppose the spread of communism." Well, there's not a country anywhere on earth that opposes communism more than Russia, because we lived that hell for 100 years. Let us into NATO so we can join you in opposing communism. But what did NATO do? Well, they kicked Russia in the teeth, is what they did. But they promised Putin that there would be no further expansion of NATO. Well, since that promise was given, 13 new nations have joined NATO, and they are right up to the border of Russia. Putin has always made clear, since Ukraine is really the birthplace of Russia, and since it sits so close to Moscow, that Ukraine is a red line and it cannot join NATO. It won't happen. Putin's made that clear for many, many years. Well, and I'm going from memory here. I think 2014, Russia had an election. And they had to decide, are we going to go with the West, the EU, and NATO, or are we going to have a closer alliance with Russia, who we've always had an alliance with? I've skipped something I need to go back to. Okay, in World War II, Russia and Germany had an alliance. And one of the first things they did was they partitioned Poland. Eastern Poland became part of the Russian Republic of Ukraine, and Western Poland was taken by Germany. Well, then Germany double-crossed Russia, and they invaded Russia. At that point, Russia changed sides and became an ally of the US, France, England, and it was on the winning side of the war. They defeated Germany and Italy. So at the end of the war, the Ukraine kept what was Eastern Poland as part of Ukraine. But Western Poland then became the nation of Poland. Now, Poland is Catholic, and it's ethnically Polish. Now, today, Eastern Ukraine has always been Russia, or at least part of Russia for a long time. The people speak Russian, they're ethnically Russian, they're Russian Orthodox by religion. So there's this divide between Eastern and Western Ukraine. Well, anyway, in this nationwide election, they elected a pro-Russian president. Well, at the end of World War II, there were Nazis in Ukraine. And the US CIA wanted a counterbalance against the Soviets at that time. So they exempted the Ukrainian Nazis from war crimes trials, and they had committed many war crimes. And they financed them and propped them up as an opposition against the Soviet Union. Well, anyway, through the years, the US CIA has been propping up and financing these Nazis. And when I say Nazis, I don't mean neo-Nazis. These are Nazis. Okay? Now, another part of history that you probably need to know is that in World War II, the Nazis killed more Russians than all people from all other countries combined. So Russians don't like Nazis. Okay, that's really important to remember. Anyway, in I think it was 2014, sometime around then. I could have the year off a little bit. But the CIA financed a violent revolution. It's called the Maidan. And that's kind of the city square in Kiev. And they financed this violent revolution where the Nazis overthrew the legitimately elected government of Ukraine and took control of the country. And then the international bankers who were supporting all of this, and the CIA is basically the puppet of the international bankers, they put in a Jew as a puppet president of Ukraine. And Zelensky is his name, Volodymyr Zelensky. And the Western Ukrainian Nazis started to commit genocide against the Russians in eastern Ukraine. Well, Vladimir Putin had taken an oath to the Russian Orthodox Church that he would protect Christians worldwide. So he really had no choice but to offer protection to the Russian Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine who were being exterminated by genocide by the Western Ukrainian Nazis. And he tried to get a peace negotiated, but the international bankers wanted nothing more than to take Ukraine in and get them deeply in debt to them. By the way, it's important to know that Russia has paid off all of their debt to the international bankers, kicked the Rothschilds, this is Putin, what Putin said, out Russia's back door. And that Russia will not be bullied by the Rothschilds. So the international bankers despise Russia because Putin has freed the Russian people of debt bondage from the international bankers. And they want to put Russia and Ukraine back into debt bondage. And that's what the war in Ukraine is all about. And in this war, the Russians are the good guys. And at the time I'm making this video, the war is over. As a matter of fact, all of eastern Ukraine has already voted to be part of the Russian republics. And there's been a signing ceremony, and they're part of Russia. And Putin made a speech, by the way, a really great speech that's on the internet. And he said that Russia would not abandon the Russians in Ukraine. So all of eastern Ukraine, which is Russian, has been re-added as a Russian republic to the Russian Federation. Now, in this war, our news media has given us all kinds of false narratives. Now, I don't know that anybody knows the exact number, but the death toll is about 7 or 10 Ukrainians killed for every Russian killed. Now, much of the fighting force of the Russians are the Ukrainians from eastern Ukraine. They're fighting on the side of the Russians. Now, I know there's talk that Russia wants to expand and take all of Europe. I don't believe that's true. I believe that Russia wants to protect their own people, and that's what this is all about. And Russia wants a peace agreement. Now, eastern Ukraine is not going back to being part of the West, okay, or be part of NATO or the European Union. It's part of Russia. And that's going to stay. And the only way we can change that or attempt to change that is through nuclear war. We need to back off and end this. Okay, now with that, I'm going to close this presentation. I've done several other presentations that give far more detail on how banks create money and why all of the human suffering on earth today is caused by the fact that giving private individuals the power to create money gives them far too much power. My name is Charlie Fuqua, and I've written a book, God's Law, the only political solution. You can get it either, it's a Kindle book, or you can get it by sending me an email at charlesrfuqua@gmail.com and send me a check of $15 and I'll send you the book. Thank you for listening. Listen to some of my other videos on Rumble.